Asia is a massive market, and I could split it into North Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and then maybe Australia and New Zealand at the bottom. These are very distinct regions. So recently, Japan had a revival of M&A activity because there's been a handover from the old to the young. And I think we're also probably seeing that in Korea as well. The older style economies generally go through that. China is a completely different beast. China obviously it's a massive market and has very strong global expansion plans of its own.
So very excited to have Marcus here all the way from Singapore. Thank you so much for joining us. We are very excited to dive and continue our conversation with M&A. You've been around doing M&A for a very long time, 30 years.
Yes.
And I'm curious if you remember, because I find the humble beginnings always important. Do you remember the first time you went through an M&A experience?
Well, my career started off in London, in the UK, actually. I started off 30 years ago as a junior banker. And I remember going to this very big office in London and actually being sent home on the very first day. It was a very prestigious company, and I was wearing brown shoes and a beautiful suit and the brown shoes. And they looked at me and they looked at my brown shoes and said, "You can't come in with brown shoes." So I actually had to go home and buy some black shoes and come back to the office. So that was my first experience of the old style, traditional British M&A.
Oh my God.
Thankfully, it's all moved on a little bit more. It's more transaction-oriented now than relationship-oriented. But that was really my first experience of the corporate finance, traditional M&A way of doing things. Eventually switched to what we call the buy side. In M&A, you have the sell side and the buy side. Sell side meaning you sell companies, or you're selling your own company. And buy side means you're buying. So I switched to the buy side and joined my client, which was a big Singapore corporate, as the CFO. And so started to experience M&A on the buy side as an investor. And then after that, I joined a big private equity fund in Japan, actually a big buyout fund, and did some big acquisitions in Japan. Then eventually I went full circle and came back and set up my own boutique. And now I'm doing M&A advisory. So I've gone all the way around in a big cycle.
Are there particular trends that you're noticing in the area that you're excited about?
Just for your audience, Asia is a massive market, and I could split it into North Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and then maybe Australia and New Zealand at the bottom. These are very distinct regions. You've got the North Asia, which is China and Japan, who are the big markets and obviously big countries in the world. And they are much more mature, especially Japan. It's a very mature economy with very big world-class companies. And they have their own dynamics. They're a little bit of a domestic economy. And there are some big companies in Japan who want to go overseas. And so there are a good source of potential, but also Japan itself, within Japan, because it's quite a domestic market and it's quite an elderly market in terms of the population. There are quite a lot of succession opportunities where older generation company owners are looking to sell out because their younger generation do not want to take over the business. So recently, Japan had a revival of M&A activity because there's been a handover from the old to the young. And I think we're also probably seeing that in Korea as well. The older style economies generally go through that. China is a completely different beast. China obviously it's a massive market and has very strong global expansion plans of its own. It's a leader in many areas and a big source of capital and technology as well for the world. China itself has some economic problems of its own, and that has restricted activity, I think, over the last year or two. But prior to that, they were quite aggressive in terms of trying to get outside of China. Once China saturated or peaked in terms of its internal growth, then a lot of the Chinese investors came out to other markets. And Southeast Asia is a big beneficiary of that. Southeast Asia is a group of countries with Singapore, but the biggest one is Indonesia, which is 260 million people. You've got Vietnam and the Philippines, which have around 100 million plus population each. And then you've got some other markets, which are 50 million type of population. So some pretty big countries coming from a relatively low economic base and growing very quickly. So there's a huge consumer market boom going on in Southeast Asia, and that's giving rise to a lot of GDP growth in all of these markets. And as a result of that, there's a lot of strategic activity and a lot of investment coming into Southeast Asia. Overall, a lot of activity in the region, very different from countries to countries.